All right, welcome everyone. Let's jump into a deep dive. You all specifically wanted us to tackle the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And to help us unpack this one, we're going with an episode from the American History Tellers podcast. I think it was called Loaded Weapon. It tells the story of Fred Korematsu and how he ended up fighting Executive Order 9066, the one that basically allowed the forced relocation of Japanese Americans, particularly those on the West Coast. It's, it's a pretty heavy topic. And you all mentioned in your request that this episode really, hit hard, and I can see why. Just picture it, December 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. The country's on edge, especially folks out on the West Coast. Now try to put yourself in Fred Korematsu's shoes. Here's a young Japanese-American guy, head over heels for a white woman, already dealing with prejudice just because of who he is, and now, bam, his own country slaps him with this enemy alien label. Talk about gut punch. And his story, man, it's got these crazy twists and turns. Like, he even thought about plastic surgery just to try and blend in and avoid being interned. Then you've got this whole loyalty questionnaire thing, where the choices were basically lose-lose no matter how you sliced it. And to top it all off, the guy ends up in a legal battle that goes all the way to the Supreme Court. So, yeah, to help us navigate all this, we've got our expert here.
Thanks for having me. I think it's a chapter of American history that really forces us to confront some tough questions, like how fear and prejudice can erode even the most basic rights we think we have.
Yeah, totally. And speaking of, really hitting hard, you mentioned in your notes that this podcast really nailed setting the scene, especially right after Pearl Harbor. What was it about that resonated with you?
Well, I think the way they captured the wave of fear that just washed over the nation after Pearl Harbor, it was really powerful. It was this feeling of vulnerability, especially out west where people were really on edge. It made them way more likely to just accept whatever the government was saying about Japanese Americans being some kind of threat.
Right, yeah. It's almost like that fear itself became a weapon.
Absolutely. And figures like General John DeWitt, the guy in charge of the Western Defense Command, they really poured gasoline on that fire. They kept pushing this idea that Japanese Americans were a fifth column, like some kind of secret enemy waiting to strike, even though there was zero evidence to back it up.
Yeah, and you actually pointed out in your notes that even J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director at the time, pushed back against some of DeWitt's claims. Like, he straight up said there was no proof of Japanese American disloyalty.
Right. It shows that this decision to intern Japanese Americans, it wasn't about national security, it was about racial prejudice, plain and simple.
Pretty messed up.
Yeah. And to really understand how deep this goes, you got to look back at the bigger picture.
Okay, so walk us through that. Like, what led to all this suspicion towards Japanese Americans in the first place?
Well, discrimination against Asian immigrants in the U.S., it didn't just appear out of thin air. You can trace it back to the mid-1800s when Chinese laborers started facing a lot of hostility. And then after the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, Japanese immigrants kind of became the new target. They're actually incredibly successful, especially in agriculture. But ironically, that success led to resentment and eventually a bunch of laws that barred them from owning land or becoming citizens.
So basically, all that prejudice from way back set the stage for the internment.
Exactly. It created this ingrained bias against anyone of Japanese descent that made it all too easy to scapegoat them after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, and that takes us to Fred Korematsu's story, which I don't know about you, but I found it really grabbed me. Like, before the war, he's this young guy working in his family's flower business, deeply in love, building a life, and then bam, everything changes. He's suddenly facing the possibility of being ripped away from everyone he loves. It's heavy stuff. I remember you even highlighted this part in your notes about him considering plastic surgery to try to avoid internment. It's just, wow.
It really does show you the level of desperation people were feeling. I mean, can you imagine having to go to those lengths just to try to stay with your loved ones, hold on to the life you've built? It gives you a glimpse of the fear and uncertainty that the entire Japanese American community was going through.
Yeah. And the thing is, Korematsu wasn't the only one who pushed back against this. Mm-hmm. The podcast also introduces us to Gordon Hirabayashi and Mitsuye Endo, these two other really brave people. Mm. And you pointed out how their legal battles were all kind of connected to Korematsu's, each challenging the internment policy in their own way.
Yeah, exactly. Hirabayashi, who was a college student at the time, he flat out refused to board the bus to an internment camp. He violated the curfew and those exclusion orders on purpose as a way to make a statement.
Huh.
And then Endo, she was a state employee, someone who had already pledged allegiance to the United States. She fought her detention, arguing that it was unconstitutional. These were acts of resistance, standing up for what they believed in when everyone else was telling them to fall in line.
Yeah, their stories really add a whole other layer to this, don't they? Like you have these ordinary people suddenly thrown into this incredibly messed up situation, forced to make these impossible choices.
Definitely. And their choices had huge consequences. Don't forget, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, they were watching all this really closely. They knew that constitutional rights were being trampled on, and they saw these cases as a way to challenge the whole internment policy.
And it's through the ACLU's work that these cases eventually end up in front of the Supreme Court. And this is where it gets really interesting and, to be honest, a little disheartening.
Yeah. Unfortunately, both Hirabayashi and Korematsu lost their cases. The Supreme Court, they were influenced by the whole wartime climate. They bought into the government's arguments about national security and ultimately ruled in favor of the internment policy.
Which is heartbreaking, especially knowing that, as you pointed out in your research, the court actually had information that contradicted those claims about the threat posed by Japanese Americans.
Yeah, a lot of people see it as one of the most shameful decisions in American legal history. But even within those rulings, there were some glimmers of hope in the dissenting opinions of Justices Frank Murphy and Robert Jackson. They saw through the government's BS and condemned the injustice of the internment policy.
Okay, so let's talk about those dissenting opinions for a second. What were their arguments and why are they so important, even though the court ended up ruling the other way?
Well, Justices Murphy and Jackson, they really got to the core of what was wrong here. Like, Murphy straight up called the internment policy racism cloaked in legalese. He saw right through the government's flimsy excuses and said, hey, there's actually no evidence to say Japanese Americans were a real threat.
Yeah, you're right. And I remember you highlighted Jackson's dissent in your notes, too, as being really powerful.
Yeah.
What stood out to you about his argument?
Well, Jackson, he was worried about the long-term impact, like what kind of message does this send if we let the government get away with this, even during wartime? He was basically saying it sets this dangerous precedent, one that could be used to justify oppressing any minority group down the line. And man, those words are almost prophetic, don't you think?
Kind of scary how relevant that still feels today.
Yeah.
But before we go there, let's bring it back to the human cost of all this. The podcast doesn't shy away from the brutal realities of life in these camps, and you mentioned the psychological toll on those who were imprisoned.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't just about being locked up. It was this total stripping away of dignity, the constant fear, not knowing what was going to happen next, and just the trauma of being labeled an enemy by your own country.
Oh, that's heavy.
It is. Families were ripped apart, people forced to live in these cramped, shoddy barracks with no privacy, barely any basic necessities.
And then, like it wasn't bad enough already, they get hit with this loyalty questionnaire, the one that asked Japanese Americans to renounce their allegiance to Japan, a country a lot of them had never even set foot in, all while their own loyalty to the U.S. was being questioned.
It was messed up. It was basically a tactic to divide people and control them even more. Put yourself in their shoes. Answer no to certain questions and risk being seen as disloyal even if you were telling the truth. Or say yes, and maybe get separated from your family if they answered differently. Lose-lose situation.
And the podcast talks about the no-no boys, the ones who refused to answer these questions because they felt like it was compromising their integrity,
Yeah.
got seen as defiant, right, and faced even worse treatment, often getting sent to even more isolated camps.
Exactly. It's a reminder of how easy it is to silence dissent, especially when everyone's scared and uncertain. But even with all that pressure, some people chose to resist in other ways, proving their loyalty to the U.S. through service.
You're talking about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, right? The one made up entirely of Japanese American soldiers. I gotta say, that part really got to me. These guys, they volunteered to fight for the country that had imprisoned their families.
Yeah, it's a powerful story. These men, they fought with incredible courage and skill in Europe and earned more medals for bravery than any other unit of their size in U.S. military history. But back home, their families were still stuck in those camps. It really shows the hypocrisy of the whole thing.
Yeah, it makes you think about what it even means to be American, right?
Yeah.
To be told you're loyal and trustworthy, but then have your basic rights and freedoms taken away.
Exactly. And even though the internment policy was eventually lifted in 1944, the fight for justice wasn't over.
And that brings us to 1981, when things take this wild turn. A researcher named Peter Irons, he's digging through government archives and stumbles upon something huge. What did he find, and why was it such a big deal?
Irons found proof that the government, they had deliberately hidden and twisted evidence during the Korematsu case. They knew there was no real threat from Japanese Americans, but they straight up lied to the Supreme Court to get what they wanted.
Wow, talk about a game changer. So this is what kicked off a whole new legal battle, right?
It did. Dale Manami, a lawyer who had seen firsthand the impact of internment on his own family, he took on Korematsu's case. Him and a whole team of lawyers, they argued that because the government lied, the original Supreme Court ruling shouldn't stand.
And in 1983, they won. Judge Marilyn Hall Patel, she overturned Korematsu's conviction and basically said the government's deception and the racist reasons behind the internment were wrong.
It was a huge win, even though it was way overdue. You actually underlined this quote from Korematsu in your notes. He said he wanted the court to reverse his conviction not just for himself, but for the whole country. His fight and the struggles of so many others, they show us that even when justice is delayed, it's always worth fighting for.
It's pretty inspiring to see that even decades later, people can still challenge injustice and hold the government accountable.
Absolutely. But there's still this one thing. The original Supreme Court decision, it's never been officially overturned.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's a big shadow hanging over everything.
Yeah.
But you also pointed out Chief Justice John Roberts' statement from 2018, where he basically condemned the Korematsu decision, calling it gravely wrong and overruled in the court of history. What do you make of that?
It was, I mean, yeah, it was a big statement for sure, acknowledging that the Korematsu decision was wrong. But I think, like you said in your notes, it doesn't really erase the damage that was done, right? And it definitely doesn't mean something like this couldn't happen again. I mean, this whole thing, it still resonates today, and it raises some pretty uncomfortable questions about, where we are as a society.
Yeah, for sure. It makes you think, like, how easily could something like this happen again? Especially when, fear and prejudice start creeping in.
It's a scary thought. And that's exactly why looking back at this period of history is so important. It's not just about understanding what happened, it's about being prepared, recognizing when something similar is happening and knowing how to stand up against it. We have to stay vigilant, especially when it comes to protecting the rights of people who are, the most vulnerable.
Right, yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that civil liberties, they're precious, but they're also fragile. And they need to be protected, especially when things get tough. We can't just assume they'll always be there. I mean, history shows us over and over again that they can be taken away, even in a country like ours.
That's a sobering thought, but it's true. And it goes back to that question you asked earlier about, what are we willing to do to make sure something like this never happens again?
Yeah, it's a question we all need to wrestle with and really think about it. How do we fight prejudice in our own lives, in our communities? How do we hold our leaders accountable? How do we create a society that's actually just and equitable for everyone?
Those are big questions, but they're important ones, ones we need to keep asking, keep talking about, and most importantly, act on.
Exactly. And I think, Fred Korematsu's story is a perfect example. He could have just stayed quiet, accepted what was happening, but he fought back even when it seemed impossible. And that refusal to give up, it helped people understand what was really going on, and it pushed for change.
His story and the stories of everyone who resisted, they show us that even when you're up against something huge, even when the odds are stacked against you, you could still make a difference.
Yeah. They remind us that justice, even if it takes a long time, is something worth fighting for.
Well, this deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least. And I want to thank you for helping us navigate this really complex and important topic. It's been tough at times, but also incredibly inspiring.
It was my pleasure. It's so important to have these conversations, so thank you for making the time to explore this.
And to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep learning about this. There are tons of resources out there, books, documentaries, museums, all sorts of stuff that can give you an even deeper understanding. And most importantly, talk about it. Share what you've learned with your friends, your family, your coworkers. Keep these stories alive and keep the conversation going. Because the only way we can learn from the past is if we remember it and apply those lessons to the world today. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration.